What's up guys, it's Double Zug. So in my last video, I went over all the PTR class changes and just did my first impressions. In this video, I'm going to go over the math and stuff. I have updated all the sheets with the changes from this patch. So I'm going to go over like the numerical impacts on healing for all the healers, as well as some play pattern stuff for like Holy. There is a potential for some more tuning before the raid releases. We got 2 testing phases. I think we might actually get a 3rd one here just because the raid was relatively buggy and there's a little bit more time between now and release. I would probably predict a 3rd raid testing to happen at some point here, although that has not been announced yet. So that said, let's start off here. I'm going to start with Restoration Shaman, which is a little bit out of left field because it was not mentioned in the patch notes, but it did receive a bug fix relatively recently, which has a small impact. It's a small buff. You can see that like all the spells that are not totems have like about a 25-26% crit chance. Healing Rain 25, Chain Heal 30, Earth Living 21, Earth Shield 26, Unleash 22. So around that 25% average. Whereas the totems both have about a 14-15% crit chance. HST is 14.5. Healing Tide is 14.9, and this is consistent across all logs because there was a bug here where the crit chance from your crit rating was applying to your totems, but for some reason the crit chance from your intellect was not applying to your totems. So in current gear, it's about a 10% crit chance buff to your totems. Healing Stream Totem has a very, very low overhealing, whereas Healing Tide has a relatively high overhealing. Again, depending on like how good of a cooldown window you get for this totem, it does smart heal. But, you know, if you're overlapping this with other totems, if it's not a good fight for raid damage, this could potentially go much higher in overhealing. So the raw impact of this is about 2%, but this could vary widely, again, depending on how much overhealing your Healing Tide totem is doing, because that's such a huge percentage of your totem healing overall. The one thing to mention here is this does go up significantly if you play Rushing Streams, which is the talent that like doubles your HST healing, although most fights you're playing Conductivity, but on ToT there are some fights where potentially some players want to be playing Rushing Streams instead, so that means this goes from 2% to maybe 3-4%, something like that. So nothing crazy to write home about here, just a nice early Christmas present for the Shamans out there. 2% healing increase. Spec did not need help, it was already great in 25 man and pretty solid in 10 man as well. Next, we're going to talk about Druid. Speaking of early Christmas presents and small buffs, all that Restoration got was increasing their spirit regen from 50% in combat to 55% in combat. Basically, how this works out mathematically is that your combat regen is determined by 6,000 base, which is just every healer has this with no gear on. And then you multiply your spirit times this out of combat regen factor, which is about 1.13. So you get a little bit more than 1 regen per spirit out of combat, and then in combat, you just divide that in half. But now instead of dividing that in half for Druid, we actually just multiply by 1.55 instead. So it's 10% more from spirit, and this ends up being like 1.5% healing increase. The other relatively significant thing this has an impact on is our stat weights. So right now, currently, Mastery and Spirit, you can see, are very, very close. This sim is right now on 6 minutes. On shorter, like 3-4 minute fights, Mastery edges out Spirit a little bit. Both are better than Intellect at a 2-to-1 ratio in this like ToT Vis-ish setup. So we will be gemming for either one of these. However, with this 10% boost to Spirit, this is going to mean that if we recalculate our stat weights, it's going to show Spirit as being a little bit higher. So there we recalculated our stat weights and we can see Spirit jumped up quite significantly here. This is going to be pretty significant across the board for how we gear, and I'll talk about this a little bit more when I talk about my vis list, but I have set up like 3 here just as an experimental thing. We have the original list here, which is just Mastery stacking. I have a vis list that went for the first haste breakpoint, and then after that heavily stacked Spirit. So you can see here I have like 10k Spirit at 13k breakpoint for rejuve. And then I have like a list that just fully stacked Spirit, got up to like 16k with relatively low crit haste, and then obviously Mastery after. And the haste bis list seemed to dramatically outperform. We do get significantly more benefit from the tier set bonuses with that more haste. Obviously Efflorescence scales well with haste. Also, the like ticks on rejuve going up means we get more benefit from the other set bonus. So there's a little bit of synergy there with the tier sets. That extra haste breakpoint means that every point of spirit you spend on rejuve as a filler is just that much more efficient. So there's a further synergy there. So I do think that overall, what you want to be doing for like farm, this is probably not going to be doable in progression, just because you won't be able to get that much haste that easily without sacrificing too much. But I do think for farm specifically, you do want to be aiming for this next breakpoint in rejuve, And the other thing that's really nice about this is, again, I mentioned that there's a little bit of tension where Mastery is better for shorter fights, Spirit is much better for longer fights. If you go super up in haste this way and then stack Spirit afterwards, even on shorter fights, you're going to be able to spend all your mana pretty effectively, and the haste is going to increase your ability to do burst HPS. So there's not as much tension there. Like, this build is going to be fine in farm for shorter fights and for longer fights, in my view. Just something to mention here. And again, this haste setup is, gemming quite significantly pure haste, making some itemization decisions to maximize that haste a little bit. So not really going to be hugely possible in progression. I'd also be very interested to see what like Volk's model on QE says about stat weights. My model seems to be valuing Spirit very, very highly, which I'm interested to see if his also does. That's something to keep your eye out on. All right, so that's Druid, Mistweaver Disc, Holy Paladin didn't really get any changes. So now we're going to talk about Holy Priest. This is, of course, the most sweeping changes, the most like playstyle relevant changes. All right, so first here, the Prayer of Healing changes. So Prayer of Healing got its healing raised by 15%. And also had 0.5 seconds taken off its base cast time for Holy Priest specifically. So you can see here, Prayer of Healing is now like by far our most efficient filler. It's almost as efficient as Prayer of Mending if it bounces 5 times, which is like kind of insane. So that 15% there is really nice. Also 0.5 seconds off the base cast time. We want to have very low haste on this build, so it's effectively just like 25% more haste on the spell, which is incredible. So the 15% buff plus the base cast time reduction means that this spell at like 0% haste is about 44% more healing per cast time. So the actual just raw HPS is very, very, very high now, much higher, 40%. That's not a small number at all. And it's going to make our filler where we're just spamming into like a big raid damage event when we don't have Divine Hymn, when we don't have like a Halo filler healing feel a lot more impactful. This is about a 4.2% HPS increase on average, and like less, about a 2% HPS increase if we're in that mode where we're just hitting everybody with Divine Star, and our raw HPS is insanely high. So, in full ToT bis, it's like 16k HPS, so not insignificant here. All right, next we have the biggest nerf to the spec, which is the 15% reduction in Divine Star healing. In average hits case, this is about a 5.5 to a 6% overall nerf, and in the best case, where we have 25 hits on D-Star, this is about a 9 to 10% nerf, because you can see in those cases where like we're hitting 10 hits with Divine Star versus 25 hits, it's like hundreds of thousands of HPS difference. So just Divine Star getting nerfed by 15% is like close to a 10% reduction in our overall healing. So this is a pretty big nerf. This is by far the biggest and most impactful nerf to the spec. One thing to mention here is that this did not affect Halo. In the situations where you get really good hits with Halo, like if you can hit the whole raid, this is still like quite strong. And if you can hit the entire raid with a fully amplified Halo, this is now actually slightly more raw HPS than just Divine Star spam. Of course, Divine Star has the advantage of having a lower cooldown, and having like less strict positional requirements. It's a lot easier for you to be stacked on the raid while the raid is stacked than for you to be 20 yards away from the raid when the raid is stacked. But again, depending on like timing of damage and stuff like that, Halo does creep up a little bit here. Cascade, still not very good, although there's some potential meme stuff in 10-man with Cascade with like renew refreshes that we'll talk about a little bit later, but an indirect buff to Halo. And Divine Star is still by far the most powerful spell in the game when the raid is stacked, and it's really not close. If you look at something like Arresto Shaman, peak HPS and ToT bis is like 370k based on the sims, whereas Holy Priest, like if it's hitting 10 targets with Divine Star, they're about on parity, but if it's hitting 25 targets with the Divine Star, it's still like 40% ahead. This spec is by no means like dead, and it's still by far the best raw HPS healer in the game in those situations where you can take full advantage of your 90 row talents. All right, so next let's talk about Renew here. So Renew got a couple of changes. First of all, the most important is that it got 3 extra seconds of duration for both the base as well as the glyphed version. And we also got a bug fix where chakras were not providing their full 35% bonus to Renew and Palm. We also got indirect buffs from it now being refreshed by Prayer of Mending in single target chakra, as well as the chakra cooldown reduction, meaning we get more refreshes on Renew for free. First of all, 25% more duration. This is a 25% efficiency and healing per cast time increase to Renew, which is significant. However, if you compare like HPM on Chakra Renew versus other things, like, this is 23, COH is 34, and POH is 51. So POH is like more than double. COH is 1.5x. So a lot of our other like filler spells significantly better than Renew, even with all these buffs. So this means that we really need to get refreshes on the Renew, like, 2 to 3 refreshes on a renew in order to have it be as valuable as something like a COH or a POH into, 3-4+ targets. A nice thing with this increased duration is that it does line up well with like our chakra cycle. So now 5-second chakra cooldown means we can go from AoE to single target and back on a 15-second cycle. However, renew is still just not very attractive as like a filler spell versus AoE spells, but it's just like less bad here. Again, since we're not really pressing this as a filler in the traditional play pattern, this isn't like a actual HPS buff. So we'll talk about this a little bit later though. For Palm, Palm is no longer an AoE spell boosted by your AoE chakra. It's now boosted by single target chakra. So if we don't change our playstyle at all, we just sit in AoE chakra and we cast all of our Palms, this is going to be a relatively significant HPS loss. It's like 2.5 in that average, and in our best D-star hits, it's like 1.6. So this is about a 10,000 HPS loss in ToT BIS. And again, this is with 0 playstyle changes, so if you never swap to single target chakra to boost this, if you're swapping for every single palm cast, you will lose 0 healing. Alright, so next I want to talk about the chakra CD reduction here. There's a couple of play patterns I tested here. So first of all, there's the play pattern where now that Palm refreshes with single target chakra and you have that lower CD, if you swap between AoE to boost your D-star and then, your COH, your POH, and then you swap to single target on cooldown to keep Palm and Holy Word Serenity on cooldown, and you use those 2 spells, which now refresh renew, to roll 2 renews for the whole fight on like tank or off tank or something like that. This overall is about like a 2 to 3% HPS increase. So this is worth about like, 11k HPS in ToT BIS. Decent HPS increase. It also gives you more like, tank healing, passive tank healing, active tank healing with Serenity. And this will of course drop if you do ever mess this up and like have to recast renew a couple times in the fight because you can't roll it perfectly, or if you mess up your chakra CD and maybe you miss casting a divine star for a few seconds, or if you ever miss, an amp on a divine star or something like that. Like if you're consistently messing this up, you probably just shouldn't do it and you should probably just play normally. But overall, like if you do this perfectly, it's a decent little increase, which is kind of nice. This adds more activity to the gameplay. And of course, if you're like, sometimes holding divine star, you have like a couple seconds here and there, you can always, even if you're not trying to do this perfectly and roll 2 renews, just swap for like Serenity and stuff like that. Serenity is decently valuable. It's only marginally more efficient than POH on 5 targets, but it's solidly more efficient than POH on like 2-3 targets. The other play pattern I tested here is actually swapping to red chakra on cooldown to amplify your Solace. So Solace does get that 50% damage increase from red chakra, which also increases its healing. And then of course, being in red chakra allows you to cast Smite for damage on the boss. So what I modeled here is, again, swapping on cooldown, amplifying every Solace, and then every time you go red, you cast Smite twice. Alright, so if you look at this chart here that's like super loose, you can see that single target chakra swapping is going to give you like 3 to 5% HPS gains from like the renew rolling, Serenity casts, as well as the fact that all your palms are now going to be amplified, or at least most of them. So a decently significant healing increase there, whereas if we look at like red, swapping, if we don't smite, we will get this 1 to 1.5% increase just from Solace. So we're really not losing that much, 2 to 4% versus the single target swap play pattern. And we gain 35% more damage just from Solace being amplified. Whereas if we look at red chakra swapping with those smites added in, our healing increase is like 0% relative to the other 2 options because the added mana we spend on smite does balance out that 1 to 1.5% gain from Solace being amplified. So we just get net neutral there, but we gain 150% more damage. So this is like, in ToT BIS, this is a relatively loose estimate, right? We get like 24k DPS from this, whereas our base is like 16, 17k DPS. Gaining this amount of DPS is pretty significant, especially if you're in the situation where you already are doing enough healing that you don't really need this 3 to 5%. You don't need like these Serenities mixed in there for more tank healing. You don't really care about rolling the renews on your tanks if it's not super threatening to those players. And if you don't care about like boosting your palms, Palm is still a decent spell to cast even outside of the single target chakra with that 35% less healing. If you don't care about like this, again, 3 to 5%, you can very easily do this red swapping playstyle, still amplify all of your divine stars, and gain a quite significant amount of damage, right? This is not, not insignificant. So overall, I think the chakra changes are pretty interesting. I think there's like, 2 clear paths here with like the red swapping and the single target swapping. You can also mix these together, obviously, swapping into red when there's lower damage, and then if the tank is threatened, you can move to single target swapping and keeping those renews up by getting your serenities out there on the tanks, etc. So kind of interesting here. Again, just the ability to sacrifice like, 15, 16k HPS for like 25k more DPS is nice, and it helps us get to parity with Disc Priest. I think if you're like doing red swapping properly, you can be relatively competitive with Disc Priest in terms of DPS, and you can do like significant burst damage on fights where there's big damage amps and stuff like that, which is nice. All right, so lastly here, I'm going to talk about the changes to our cooldowns. So first of all, we had Divine Hymn. Penalty on the healing was raised to 50% from 35%. This is about a 2.5% reduction in our raw. That's the nerf side of the cooldown changes. The thing here is that Divine Hymn is still like a very powerful cooldown. It still gives the 10% healing amplification, and it's still enough in itself to cover a damage mechanic. So I don't think this nerf really hits us too hard, honestly. The last change we got to our cooldowns is that Lightwell Renew and the Light Spring Renew, which is like the clickable Lightwell, both now benefit from our single target chakra. So that means they do 35% more healing if you are in yellow chakra. You cannot like snapshot this. I tested it on a PTR, and you have to like actively be in single target chakra when the person gets the renew in order to benefit from it. If you're playing like standard where you just stay in AoE chakra the whole time, this actually doesn't benefit your healing at all. But there's a couple of ways you can get around this. If you're doing the like single target swapping where you're in single target chakra like 40-50% of the time, maybe a little bit less than a 1% increase to a 1% increase. The thing is here though, if you have both the glyphs, like if you have the extra charges and the clickable glyph, which the clickable glyph increases the healing by 50%, and then you get 35% multiplier on top of that. If you have both of those glyphs, this is actually like a 3% healing increase, so this fully makes up for the entire Divine Hymn nerf if you take full advantage of both of those glyphs and you're in single target chakra when you do them. And the last thing I'll mention here, which is a little bit of a meme, is that Lightwell Hot does actually gain ticks from haste. So specifically if you're like in single target chakra and you put your Lightwell down and you have the click glyph, and you press Troll Zerk, you get an extra tick on your Lightwell Hot. If everybody clicks it in that 10-second window, is 5% more healing. Kind of crazy. This more than makes up for the Divine Hymn nerf. So if you're an insane person, you can get your raid to do this. This is actually particularly powerful in 10-man because the entire raid can get the hot. So it's like a full raid cooldown. And then after the full raid gets the hot, you get 7 more. And this also does make Troll racial like very strong for Holy Priest, which is kind of interesting. So if you're playing Troll for like Shadow Priest, this is a decent use for it. Although again, you have to get your raid to click this. If you have like the normal Lightwell version that's just smart healing, it's much more difficult to control when it procs, right? So that it procs like inside your haste buff. The other thing to mention is that Lightwell does snapshot intellect on cast. I could not get it to snapshot critical strike or haste, but it absolutely does snapshot your intellect when you cast it. So pre-pull, if you like pre-pot with a int pot, you can put your Lightwell down like a minute and a half before the pull, any kind of trinket procs or anything like that. So if you're recasting your Lightwell 3 minutes, 2 minutes into the fight, it can actually be quite useful to pay attention to like int procs or anything like that, especially if you are doing this like insane glyph Zerk tech with it. All right, so all that yapping aside, what's the takeaway here? This is about a 10 to 12% reduction in your raw overall healing on Holy Priest. Again, this brings us more in line in like the average Divine Star hits case with other HPS healers like, Shaman, Druid, etc. But again, in those like peak HPS situations where we're still hitting 20, 25 players with our Divine Star, we are still post-nerf far ahead of every other healer, and it's really not close. So Holy still has that insanely powerful niche, basically in an identical spot as it was before, where it's a very, very powerful swap from disc on certain fights. Main takeaway here is that now it's just better for like 10-man, better for fights where you aren't stacked, because your filler healing is a little bit better. You have a lot more leeway to swap into single target to do spot healing or tank healing, and you also just do more damage. So honestly, I think this is like mostly just a buff to Holy in terms of playstyle and the numbers. All right, so the next question I want to answer here is if this affects our stat weights. It actually does a little bit. Our like micro CDs and our macro CDs and like Divine Star and him doing less healing means we're going to get less scaling out of like intellect, crit, mastery, and POH being buffed means that spirit gets a little bit better. So this means that in those like more average cases where we're only getting like 10 hits on our Divine Star or whatever, spirit's actually our best stat now. Mastery and crit are still better than spirit on like shorter fights as well as fights where the raid's pixel stacked, because Divine Star obviously doesn't scale with Spirit, and it's so much of our healing. All right, so this is the class changes. In terms of impact on balance, I think there's not a huge impact here. I think Priest is still in an excellent spot with a lot of really good disc fights this tier, and then a couple of great holy fights as well. I think Shaman's in a great spot just with Storm Lash, the 10% HP buff, all of its cooldowns being great. I think Holy Paladin's really strong. There's lots of tank buster stuff. There's lots of use for bop. And just their throughput's really strong, especially on spread out fights where you can just do EF. I think Druid's also really good. I think Iron Bark is like insane for any kind of tank buster, as well as the fact that it doesn't really care if people are stacked as much. Obviously you get less value from your Efflo and your Mushroom Bloom, but being able to rejuve people who are anywhere is great. And there's a similar thing for Mistweaver, right, where Mistweaver does fine on spread healing, and it also does take advantage of the damage amps this tier really well, and, you know, cleave as well. So I think all the healers are in a great spot going into ToT. I think the racing comps are still probably just going to be like double Priest Shaman as the core, and then maybe you'll get like another Shaman or another Mistweaver for more damage, or potentially like a Holy Paladin, depending on like what tanks they want to run, if they want those bops really badly or something like that, or if they just value the safety. I think that's like the racing comps, but for most players, again, you can really take any healers. They're all great. And I think you can even play like mono Holy more defensively this patch, just because Holy got a lot stronger in terms of its flexibility with the chakra changes. All right, so that's the video. If you enjoyed, send a like, comment, subscribe, etc. I will be testing the gear on PTR now and releasing some videos about Bislis and trinkets and stuff like that. So if you're interested, stay tuned. I also will be, of course, releasing like healing guide videos for the bosses. So yeah, thanks for watching. See ya.
Swobu, Zug Zug.